And now I'd like to introduce you to our two co-hosts, Jim Lang and Vince Bowers. First, we have Jim. He's a lawyer with the law firm of Pender and Coward. He focuses his practice on protecting Virginians who live, work, and play on the water. Jim established the waterfront waterfront property law practice. He and the other three attorneys in this group routinely handle all aspects of riparian property rights, maritime and admiralty law, and environmental law. Clients consistently come to Jim and the waterfront team when they need help in court, wetlands boards, and with MRC. And next, I'd like to introduce our co-host, Vince Bowers. Vince is the Landscaping and Living Shoreline Coordinator at Lynnhaven River Now. Following graduation from the United States Naval Academy with a degree in oceanography, Vince became a naval aviator and moved to Virginia Beach, where he served for 35 years. While not on sea duty, Vince studied the issues impacting our local waterways and volunteered countless hours supporting programs involving stewardship of our local waters. Vince brings education, observation, and experience to Lynnhaven River Now, and now to our audience for this webinar. With that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Vince and Jim. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Really glad you joined us, and really glad to have Vince Bowers with us today. And not only, in addition to all the other accolades that properly belong on Vince's resume, he's also an Eagle Scout. Anyways, a quick slide on what we're going to cover today. It's going to be a windshield tour of the Living Shoreline Law. And the reason that we're going to move through that so quickly is because we have a great expert with us today who's going to give us all the ins and outs of installing a living shoreline. And I don't want to cut into his time, but also we did an in-depth review of the Living Shoreline Law about 1.5 years ago. It's available on my website. You can see the URL there. So click into that if you need an in-depth look at the Living Shoreline Law. After we finish our windshield tour of the Living Shoreline Law, which we'll move pretty quickly through that, we will get some lessons learned from building living shorelines from Vince. And then we'll get some lessons learned in the permit process from me. I've got a lot of analytics on how the regulatory process has been working for people who have been looking for permits for either hardened or living shoreline. So let's just jump into the windshield tour. Quick slide on what a living shoreline is. Gave you the definition out of the Virginia Code. And then there's a lot of benefits to a living shoreline. I've listed several of them here. I know Vince is going to touch on those in more detail. One of the cons with a living shoreline is sometimes cost can be a factor. Quick look at a really beautiful living shoreline, really nice photo. But just because you have a living shoreline doesn't mean that you're going to be free from shoreline erosion. As you see from this very tall scarp along a riverbank here, this was a living shoreline that was receiving either a lot of energy from wave or boat action, or a lot of energy from currents, whatever it was. Your living shoreline is not going to survive unless the circumstances are right for it to thrive. And I know Vince is going to talk about what those circumstances are. If you don't have a living shoreline, you're going to have a hardened shoreline. So instead of living plants to protect your shoreline from erosion, you're talking about engineered shore structures, also called an armored shoreline. The interesting thing to me is that hardened shorelines were the way to go for decades here in Virginia. I've given you some statistics on how much of the shorelines are armored along the Chesapeake Bay. You'll see more prevalence of armored shorelines in the urban areas. But really interesting to me when I took a look at how the regulatory process has been running, it would appear that the adoption of the Living Shoreline Law in 2020 has turned around to the trend towards always going to hardened shorelines. We're seeing a lot more prevalence of living shorelines now, which I would attribute to the adoption of the Living Shoreline Law in 2020. And we'll get into that more deeply after Vince shares with us his expertise on building living shorelines. Here's a quick example of a hardened shoreline. Instead of plants, you see rocks in this picture, classic hardened shoreline. This photo is one where we're going to stand in the same place on this pier. And first we're going to look right, which is what we're doing right now. And in a minute, we're going to look left. On the right, when we look right, this photo, you're seeing a hardened shoreline and no problem with shoreline erosion. You look to the left, same vantage point, just turn to the left, and you see the results of not having anything protecting that shoreline. Why all the back and forth on hardened shorelines versus living shorelines? It's because of the law adopted in 2020 by the General Assembly. I've given you the citation to the code provision there. Keywords, you will use only a living shoreline unless best available science shows that that approach is not suitable, in which case you still have to incorporate living shorelines to the extent practicable in your design. The key on application of this law is how are local wetlands boards and how are the VMRC going to interpret best available science? How are they going to interpret suitability, those key words in the statute? And always lingering in the not too distant background is how much is it going to cost for me to put in a living shoreline as opposed to how much I'd have to spend to install a hardened shoreline. Again, best available science and cost being the key points. And on best available science, the VMRC issued its wetlands guidelines in May 2021, where they said that VIMS will be the arbiter in those situations when best available science is in contention. And I've given you a citation to my website where we have an article we've published on best available science that's specific to the living shoreline scenario. On cost, both the statute and the wetlands guidelines don't say anything about costs. So they don't say whether cost should be a factor or cost ought not to be a factor. I've given you here a citation to a blog article on my website that analyzes how cost ought to be applied specific to the living shoreline situation. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a slide that specifically lists all of the resources that I'm going to touch on through this presentation and several others that would be useful to people who have who need to learn more about living shorelines. We've got a slide here touching on implementation at local wetlands boards. The wetlands boards play a key role because whether you're going to install a living shoreline or a hardened shoreline, it's probably going to take place in the intertidal zone. And that's where the local wetlands boards have jurisdiction. And so the local wetlands board is going to make the first decision about whether you or your client gets to install a living shoreline or is required, or gets to install a hardened shoreline. This leaves open the possibility of a lot of variation because there are so many local wetlands boards in Virginia. But thankfully, the VMRC is monitoring the proceedings at all those local wetlands boards. They are well connected with the staff at the local wetlands board. They also attend the local wetland board hearing, and they bring that information back to the VMRC. And if there is a local wetlands board decision that's out of line with the VMRC's view of how this law should be administered, the VMRC has the ability under statute to reach down and grab that decision and bring it to the VMRC to be reviewed there and adjusted if the VMRC thinks that's necessary. Additionally, an applicant at the local wetlands board who doesn't like the decision they got at the local wetland board, they can appeal that decision to the VMRC. And if they don't like the decision they got at the VMRC, they can take it to circuit court and get a court review of the decision. And with that, your windshield tour is over. And let me hand it over to Vince to share with us his experience in installing living shorelines. Vince, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And it's a pleasure to be here. Really glad we decided to do this together. First thing I'd like to say is we have seen a lot of improvement in our waterways locally because of a lot of different actions. I think the Lynn Haven River is a really good example of that. in that 20 years ago, you could only eat shellfish out of about 1% of that waterway. Today, after 20 years of cleaning it up and working on it, we are able to eat oysters out of about half of it. So great improvement, but our waterways are still somewhat degraded. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could eat oysters out of 90% or maybe 100% of the Lynn Haven? So there's no doubt that the community would like to see our waterways clean and healthy. And we've done the things that we've done, oyster restoration and regulations that don't allow boats to dump their bilges in the river, and shoreline work have all contributed to that improvement. But to get there, we're going to have to really focus on improving the watershed and restoring those wetlands. So a nice picture here of a living shoreline, used no tow, or it did use sand fill for this, but you can see that it's done quite well. The changes that I've seen since the legislation has changed have all been positive. There's been a whole lot more interest by homeowners and a willingness. They know that it's going to probably cost a good bit, but more willingness to try living shoreline approaches to erosion. I've also seen staff and consultants and installers gain a lot of experience in living shorelines over the past couple of years. So it's a lot easier to find someone who knows how to do a living shoreline. Although we're still working on that. There are programs with Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professionals who are developing a training and certification program for living shoreline installation. Wetlands Watch, Elizabeth River Project, the James River Association, and of course, Lynn Haven River Now, we all have programs to help with living shoreline installations. That includes some assistance programs. The cost, again, is pretty steep, but when you can use volunteers for the labor, that helps a lot. And overall, the streamlined permits are also helping improve the number of living shoreline projects that I'm seeing. The November Wetlands Board is a great example. The Virginia Beach Wetlands Board, I've been going to those for about 5 years. And back in November, that board is charged with no net loss of wetlands. And back in November, we actually had a number of proposals that were adding wetlands, and they ended up with a net gain of about 6,000 square feet of wetlands, which is a real improvement to no net loss. And then since then, I've seen several other wetlands boards that resulted in net gains. So that's all, you know, the
Look at this thing.
individual landowners and the staff and the board itself are all helping improve the wetlands. Suitability is always an issue. I've seen the most to find a property not suitable.
They don't know what that
The
means.
upland slope.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Water right off of the shoreline, the near shore depth. Wave energy, of course, whether it's wind driven by a long fetch or boat wakes. Shade is another issue. A lot of areas had trees planted back when the homes were built 40, 50 years ago. And now those trees have matured and they're shading the shoreline. And unfortunately, the
Is when he was asking.
primary vegetation that we use in the wetland zone, flora, won't grow in the shade. And then structures that are too close to the water, like swimming pools, sheds, and sometimes the homes themselves. And not every property is suitable, and that's not unlike natural shorelines. In that there are plenty of areas on natural shorelines that don't have vegetated wetlands just because naturally the area doesn't support it. Well, the same is true of man-made shorelines. So, there are plenty of areas that are not suitable, but I think if you do an honest assessment of property, you're going to find a lot of opportunity, and that's what
I guess he didn't copy.
Well, no,
a lot of
he
opportunity.
said he did, but it's just,
for wetlands.
and he called it specs.
If I could just jump in, we're picking up a lot of conversation in the background. Could you please,
I thought I copied you the RMB standards.
whoever's talking about Army standards, we need them to mute, please. Go ahead, Vince. Sorry.
Not a problem. So the cost of living shorelines, as Jim mentioned earlier, sometimes it seems kind of prohibitive. But whenever asked about, how does a living shoreline compare to a bulkhead or riprap, I have to answer, it depends. On the left, you see a photo of a living shoreline that was done at First Landing State Park. It used core logs, which is a coconut fiber log that's dissolves in about 3 years. It gives the grasses enough time to get well rooted. And it used goose fencing to keep the geese from pulling those tasty young grasses out. And it used volunteer labor to install the grasses. So all in all, a project like that is going to cost a whole lot less than a bulkhead or riprap because it didn't need sand fill, it didn't need a hardened toe, and it didn't need a lot of heavy labor at high cost. On the right is an example of a private property project that we're actually doing right now in Lincoln Bay that frankly, it is going to cost a lot. It's going to cost more than riprap would have or a bulkhead. But the homeowner wanted to do it the right way. They had experienced a lot of loss of wetlands over time. And in this case, we used oyster castles for the toe. We will barge in 2 barge loads of sand, which is the highest portion of the cost, to backfill to the correct elevations for the grasses, and then we're going to plant it. In order to make this affordable, we actually hand carried all of those oyster castles with volunteers. And we will spread the sand and plant the area with volunteers as well to help make this an affordable project because it benefits everyone. It's going to benefit the water quality in the community. So that's where nonprofits can help out. And then there's also funding from sources like the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program will pitch in for a living shoreline project. And there's other grant sources as well that can help with those costs when you do have a case where it's going to be an expensive living shoreline.
Vince, does your group Lynn Haven River now, does it know how to connect people who have one of these projects with those resources that can help keep the cost down or subsidize it?
Absolutely.
Could you speak to that a little bit?
That's what I do. I go out when people have a shoreline erosion issue and they want to do a living shoreline. I'll go out and in some cases it's not suitable, but in many cases it is suitable. And then I'll work with contractors and volunteers, recruit volunteers, and help them through the VCAP process, things like that, to help lower the cost to where it's affordable. there were several pictures throughout. All the pictures that I'm showing are projects that we've done. And in each of those cases, we've used volunteers, we've gotten VCAP funding, things like that to help those shorelines become a reality. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that when you're weighing the costs, you also need to weigh the benefits. When it comes to a bulkhead, you're pretty much paying for just erosion protection. It doesn't have a whole lot of other benefits. Riprap, yeah, it's somewhat helpful in terms of oyster recruitment and marine life, giving it a little bit of habitat. But the reality in this area is that a rock habitat is not a natural thing. It's natural in Maine, but not in Virginia Beach. And so it's limited in the amount of habitat, and it's definitely limited in the amount of filtration and carbon reduction that it produces. The living shoreline gives you all the benefits. It does the erosion control. As you can see in this picture, there are oyster castles. This is along Bay Island. They've recruited a lot of oysters, improved the habitat. People who fish this area say that it has attracted a lot of marine life. It's starting to fill in with the grasses. In this case, we didn't plant the grasses. We put the oyster castles down. So this wasn't really a living shoreline design, because a living shoreline design would include the fill and the grasses and everything. But this one has recruited the grasses on its own behind the oyster castles and populated. So it's providing that extra filtration, that extra beauty, and also the extra carbon reduction. This is an example, and it might be a little difficult to see depending on what size screen you're looking at, but if you look out at the end of this little spit, you can see there's a row of oyster castles and then a vegetated shoreline behind it. You can also see that that shoreline extends a good 6-7 feet beyond the adjacent shoreline that has eroded. And it's an example of the living shorelines really do work when it comes to preventing erosion. And in this case, those oyster castles are covered with oysters. The vegetation is providing habitat for fish and birds and other wildlife. So you're seeing all the benefits there. Can't see them all in the picture, but they are there. I've been out to this site, and actually there's some studies going on right now on the wildlife that are attracted to living shorelines to compare, because living shorelines, when done properly, they're going to mimic a natural shoreline and provide all the same habitat and ecosystem services as a natural shoreline would, which are all improvements for the entire community. I think that's the end of my slides.
Okay, well, Vince, that was great. Thank you. Appreciate it. So Vince made the point that there's a lot of benefits that come from a living shoreline. Some of those benefits are felt by the property owner in terms of erosion control and the like, but some of the other benefits really accrue to the community at large. And so whenever you have a situation where the person who has to write the check is getting, they're thinking about the benefits they're getting. They're not necessarily thinking about the benefits that everyone's going to get. And so if the living shoreline costs more than the hardened shoreline, the person who has to write the check is probably going to opt for the lower cost option rather than write the bigger check and in the name of creating benefits for the community. other than there are some altruistic people out there who would go with the more expensive approach because it would help the community, but by and large, a lot of people won't. And just because of that, raw truth about human behavior, that's the reason why, in the absence of a law like this living shoreline law, you're not going to get very many living shorelines. But this law came in 2020, and the data that I'm seeing suggests that it is changing behavior. And to collect the data that I'm going to share with you today, I went back and looked at all of the hearings at the VMRC over the last 22 months, July 2020, when the new law took effect, July 1, through the most recent VMRC hearings, which were conducted just a few weeks ago at the end of May. And I found out of that collection of cases, 18 that trigger the living shoreline law. And the vast majority, if not all of those cases, were cases where the applicant was dealing with either just shoreline erosion and wanted it stopped, or it was shoreline erosion coupled with failed bulkheads, because you install a bulkhead, it's going to get you about 15 years, and then it's going to give out, and then your erosion is going to kick back in again when the bulkhead fails. Now, out of these 18 cases that I'm sharing with you, I recognize there's a data gap, because there are any number of living shoreline situations where the permit is issued without a VMRC hearing, without need of a VMRC hearing. One example would be if the decision made by the local wetlands board on whether the living shoreline needed to be installed, if that decision is not appealed by anybody, and assuming the VMRC didn't see that it needed to bring the decision before the VMRC on its own initiative because they thought the wetlands board really got it wrong, and that doesn't happen very often. Those unappealed decisions, that's the end of it. And so it never shows up in a VMRC hearing on the living shoreline issue. There's a lot more living shoreline decisions out there than the 18 that I'm going to talk to you about because of unappealed decisions by the local wetlands board. And projects at the VMRC that are under $500,000 and there's no protest that's been filed, well, the VMRC staff has the authority to administratively issue the permit. It never comes before a hearing. So there's a vast number of shoreline decisions that get made without a VMRC hearing, and the data that I'm going to talk to you about comes only from VMRC hearings. But that's why the number is so low, only 18 of them in 22 months. But out of those 18, it was interesting to me to see who's applying for some sort of situation that triggers the living shoreline law, and that the majority of those cases were residential cases. The next highest was governmental, and then commercial. There were a handful of commercial applicants. And in almost all of these cases, it was either just dealing with shoreline erosion, or it was dealing with a failed bulkhead coupled with shoreline erosion that's occurring again because the bulkhead has failed. In the cases that I looked at, 4 of them were people who just straight up asked to install a living shoreline. And as you might expect, those always got approved. And so in a minority of the situations, you have an applicant who wants to install a living shoreline, probably a situation similar to the one Vince shared with you with the oyster castles, and the situation where Lynnhaven River now provided volunteer labor to help keep the costs down and helped to get some VCAP funding for that project. And then almost half of the cases are situations where the applicant asked for a mix of a living and a hardened shoreline. And some of these that are in this category were situations where somebody came to the VMRC and they wanted to install a hardened shoreline, exclusively hardened shoreline, but the staff at the VMRC explained to the applicant that it might be difficult to get that approved because of the new living shoreline law. And and offered to the applicant things that the applicant could do to modify their design in order to increase the likelihood of it being approved, and the applicant did that. And so the application migrated from one where the applicant sought only a hardened shoreline, and then modified their application to include elements of a living shoreline. And so it was a mixed situation. And then there were about a third of the cases where the applicant just wanted a hardened shoreline. That's what they wanted to do. And some of those got approved because the site wasn't suitable for the kind of reasons that Vince pointed out earlier. There are some sites where a living shoreline just is not suitable. So having worked through that data, what I found was that the amount of living shoreline that has been approved through those 18 cases is just a little bit shy of 6,000 feet. And the amount of hardened shoreline that was approved was a little bit north of 6,000 feet, but not very far off from a 50-50 split. And this is what suggested to me that the trend of always, just knee jerk, let's install a bulkhead, let's install a hardened shoreline to deal with my shoreline erosion issue, that trend is now beginning to reverse. We're seeing a lot more living shoreline now being installed in situations where in past years, it would have all been a hardened shoreline. In 15 of the 18 cases, they were situations where the living shoreline issue was no longer a live issue by the time the case reached the VMRC for a hearing. And that's because the local wetlands board had jurisdiction to decide whether the project should be a living shoreline or a hardened shoreline. Nobody appealed it. And so the case still came on for a decision at the VMRC, but it was on other issues. And then cost was only heavily contested in 2 of the cases that I looked at. Both of them, I've given you the citation for it, the hearing, the month in which the hearing was held, the name of the case, and the joint permit application number. And the most recent one was in March of this year. And this was a really interesting case because this applicant had been before the local wetlands board twice and in front of the VMRC previously at least once, perhaps twice, and kept getting pushback from the local wetlands board over the need in the view of the local wetlands board to include more living shoreline elements. And the applicant was pointing out the cost as being the chief impediment. The difference in the cost was $12,000 for the applicant's preferred approach, which did incorporate some elements of living shoreline, but the local wetlands board was pushing for a solution that would cost more on the order of about $70,000. And the applicant was in front of the VMRC saying, the cost ought to be considered here, and you should give me a permit for this $12,000 solution. And the commission and the VMRC staff in the recommendation it wrote up in advance of the hearing supported the applicant on that point of view. And yet when it came on for hearing at the VMRC, the commission held on a 5-to-1 vote that cost ought not to be considered and sent it back to the wetlands board for them to hear the next revision of how this applicant would change his design to bring it more in line with what the local wetlands board was looking for. And there is a blog article on my website that focuses on that case, if you'd like to look into it in more detail. Best available science is always in play in these cases because you'll have different points of view as to whether there's enough shade or not enough shade, or whether the bottom is strong enough to support a sill, whether the plants would grow or not grow, whether the fetch is too much. And all of that, all the different views on that implicate the best available science standard. But even though that gets argued back and forth in these cases, and the commission has to decide in what direction to go, the best available science has never really been explicitly focused and contested in any of these hearings in any of the cases that I looked at. And of course, there's been no court review as yet of any living shoreline case. So the precedent that we have has all been generated within the regulatory agencies, and there has been no judicial review. With that, I'm going to give you our list of living shoreline resources. Very busy slide. You don't need to write any of this down because we will post the PowerPoint and also our webinar on my website. It takes us a couple of weeks to get it posted, but it'll be there for you as a resource that you can use going forward. And with that, that wraps up our presentation today.